So very, very good to be here with you all, and particularly this week, a year on from Bhante's death. Very sort of, it just feels like the place to be. Yeah, it's a privilege to be up here. When I was asked to give this talk, I was asked which of the three yanas would I choose, and I sort of said the Mantrayana, and then the last couple of days I've been thinking, you silly man, what on earth do you know about the Mantrayana? And why did you choose that? And I don't really know. Let's see what happens. So yeah, I'm not, what's to say, a scholar or an expert in the Mantrayana or the Vajrayana, however you want to call it. And yes, so I won't be giving a sort of formal talk on that path. But I am very struck that Bhante's last piece of writing was called A Word on the Mantrayana. He wrote that from the 8th to the 13th of October last year, so 2 weeks, just over 2 weeks before he died. So his last words to the order are a word on the Mantrayana, which surely must be very significant. I don't actually know what the significance is, but it is significant, I'm sure. And his second to last piece of writing, which was written just a couple of weeks prior to that, a few weeks prior to that, was on rebirth. Rebirth Revisited, it was called. And in that piece of writing, he also talked about the Paramitayana and the Mantrayana, the Bodhisattvayana. The Shravakayana and the Bodhisattvayana. And in that piece of writing, he was urging us to be clear when we were talking about the goal of Buddhism, the goal of the Dharma life, to be clear as to whether we meant nirvana, as the Shravakayana would term it, or full and perfect enlightenment, as the Bodhisattvayana would term it. And it's fairly obvious to me that Bhante was talking because he felt, in those terms, because he felt he needed to. He needed to, at this time, talk to us in those terms. And because prior, my understanding had been that, we weren't a Three Yana kind of movement, and Bhante hadn't laid out the path in that sort of system. So it was obviously relevant to us at that time, and probably still is, because much of the debate in the order around insight seemed to sometimes be talking about different ideals, different goals, and I think Bhante was addressing that, or trying to address that. But let me read you a little bit of what he says on the Mantrayana in his last piece of writing. The follower of the Mantrayana, also known as the Vajrayana, may practice the paramitas and even the ethics and meditation of the Shravakayana. But what really propels him or her along his or her chosen path is the fact that he or she practices with the help of mantras. It is the mantras that do the work, so to speak. Not only do they do the work, but mantras have the effect of shortening the time in which the bodhisattva or mantrin takes to achieve his or her goal. Indeed, with the help of mantras, one may be able to achieve supreme perfect enlightenment within the compass of a single human lifetime, as Milarepa is believed to have done. So, I don't completely know what to make of that. And in a way, Bhante later on talks about it's not obvious in the tradition how somebody like Milarepa, where he fits, because Samyak Sambodhi, supreme and perfect enlightenment, is defined as becoming a Buddha, a perfectly enlightened Buddha, in a place where there is no Dharma, and then turning the wheel for the first time. So what I take from that, and Bhante points that out, is what I take from that is that we can't take the traditions just literally at face value. I think Bhante's time and again guarded against literalism. He's urged us to guard against literalism. And of course the three yanas, if you take them literally, they'll contradict each other in irreconcilable ways. There's no sort of getting round that. And I think it's been part of Bhante's genius at surveying the tradition and being faithful to the tradition while seeing beyond the surface and not getting caught up in literalism, seeing into the essence of what's going on. And I think he's trying to urge us to keep doing that, to keep doing the same. And I think some of the time, some of the polarization that we can get into, perhaps I've got into, seem to be because we have as individuals, sometimes a narrower, more literal view of a particular practice or a particular set of practices, even a particular path. So we're not a Vajrayana movement. Bhante has made that very clear. We're not a Mantrayana movement. And yet, it's a very important part of our movement. It's obviously a very important part of Bhante's own practice. So many of his main teachers were Vajrayana teachers. Some of the greatest Vajrayana teachers of the 20th century were Bhante's teachers. And there's a lineage that we're in, I think. And yet it's not the traditional Vajrayana lineage. I think one of the things Bhante... I was recently reading the Tantric Path series of lectures. We were studying them in my Mitra group, and I think one of the things Bhante has given us is he's really urged us to free the imagination, to in a way, to cultivate the imagination and to see the imagination as a quality that is the whole of a human being. All of the qualities brought together, reason and emotion and will, brought together and transcended in this higher quality of the imagination with a capital I. And he's based the imagination very firmly on right view, So I think Subhuti makes this point, doesn't he, in Reimagining the Buddha, that imagination, as it were, without a foundation of right view, perhaps you could say the right view that comes from the other yanas, the Shravati yana and the Bodhisattva yana or the Paramita yana, without a foundation in right view, the imagination can fly off into fantasy. And fantasy can be, well, at best useless and at worst dangerous. But then without the imagination, you're left with something essential missing from the human experience, from our existential experience, and from the goal. The goal isn't going to be open to reason. Reality isn't going to be open to reason. And it's not even going to be open to all of our goodwill, all of our positive emotion alone won't reveal things as they are. Some other faculty, some sort of... I'm not going to try and define the imagination, but something that transcends reason and emotion and will is going to be required. And Bhante's urged us in that and shown us that and exemplified that and taught us that time and time again. So I think this is one of Bhante's great gifts and geniuses. And of course I was earlier in the year I was sitting in Bhante's flat. I had the privilege of just sitting there on my own. I spent, I don't know how long, a couple of hours one evening. I was here I think in January, so not long after Bhante had died, and spent some of an evening sitting there just looking at his possessions. And normally when I'd been into the living room, into the lounge where you meet Bhante, I hadn't looked around. You don't, do you? You just want to... Well, I'm too nervous anyway, but also you just want to focus on meeting Bhante. But this time I looked around, and there were so many photos of his teachers and Rupas, and I went into his bedroom, which I'd never done, and the shrines in his bedroom, and I opened the wardrobe, which, I don't know, may seem a bit naughty or cheeky, but anyway, I did. I opened the wardrobe, and hanging in on the rail, there was just a set of grey things, cardigans, I guess, grey cardigans and trousers, sort of identical looking. And then at the end, just at the very end, some of you will have seen this, there's this bright yellow silk Tibetan brocade shirt, tunic, whatever they're called, embroidered, richly embroidered, and just right at the end of this row of grey cardigans and trousers. And I just felt that was so emblematic of the man, this incredible combination that's almost sort of unbelievable, really. This very, so you sit, and I sit in front of Bhante, and there is this very cultured, kindly, elderly gentleman in grey, and of course he's also a tantric guru somewhere. At least that's how I see him. But you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know that if you met him in the street. You have to sort of be receptive to Bhante, and I think we have to be receptive to his words now that we don't have his physical presence. In his words, for example, in these last writings, I think are sort of termas. They're hidden teachings that we'll have to sort of dig up and unearth and bring, explicate for ourselves. Sometimes just reading Bhante, something is transmitted. I felt this very, very strongly. Just over a year ago, I was on a 6-month solitary retreat, and I reread all his memoirs for the 3rd or 4th time, and so there was nothing. Although I had forgotten some of the encounters and details and the colour of it all, there was nothing particularly new for me, and yet something magical was being. Well, I was experiencing something magical just reading about Bhante's life. It was like the Dharma was being transmitted through reading him. He goes on to say in this... He said that a Western scholar has therefore suggested that the Mantrayana should be known in English as the path of magic. And I loved that he said that. Because I think magic has been something that has led me to the Dharma. Without magic, I don't think I would have found the Dharma. And I don't think I would have, in a sense, stayed practicing the Dharma. Of course, magic has lots of connotations, and at its crudest, I don't know what it is. It's well, in my case, as a kid, it was bed knobs and broomsticks. I was pre-Harry Potter, so it was witches on broomsticks, and I was sure that I was a wizard I imagined myself as a magician, as a wizard. I do this. I can remember with Tony Boyce, one of my fellow wizards, we were always trying to turn coal into diamonds in a metal dustbin by lighting fires. Anyway, that was part of our kind of alchemical urge. As I, I wasn't 15, I was 6 or something. So, and I can remember the first time I chanted a mantra. It was very, very important to me at that time. And I can't exactly remember how old I was, but I was probably 7 or 8. I was in primary school, and I invented my own sort of religion, really, or deity, who happened to be called Yalsva. And the name came from looking at shapes in the clouds and then taking the letters from those shapes and making this word Yalsva. And I got a whole classroom of fellow kids to, under their breath, chant Yalsva. Yalsva, 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 Yalsva. This was my mantra. And we were chanting to make it snow, because if it snowed, you were allowed extra time at playtime to play in the snow. And it snowed. So that was my first experience of the Mantrayana, I think. And it worked. So I did think of myself as some mantrin, some magician, early on. The next time I remember chanting a mantra, I was born into a Hindu family, so I guess it wasn't so strange to chant. But I didn't ever feel like I was Hindu. I wasn't practicing Hinduism anyway, and I didn't really believe in it. Apart from when I was 11, and one night my father started having a heart attack, and it was the night he died. He died of that heart attack, and I was in my bedroom, and he was in agonizing pain for about 5 hours. The doctor came and gave him painkillers, said it wasn't anything to worry about. It was muscular pain, da-da-da-da. Anyway, and this was in the 70s, and, treatment wasn't so effective for heart attacks and things. So I was told to go back to bed. I can remember holding his hand and him talking to me. It was obviously it's an experience that has shaped my life. I went back to bed and was chanting a Hindu mantra. That's all I could think of. And I can remember visualizing a garland of mantras around the house, asking for protection so that death couldn't enter. And I can remember, I fell asleep. And a friend of the family, a cousin of mine, came to stay with me while my mother went in the ambulance, which eventually arrived, to take my father to the hospital. And he died en route. And when I woke up, I instantly knew that he'd died. And one of my first thoughts, it's all a bit of a jumble, but one of my first thoughts was I should have chanted the mantra to protect him. The garland should have been around him, not around the house, because he died outside the house. But I was still convinced that, as it were, the magic worked, but I had been too silly. Later on, I hope you don't mind me talking personally. I want to, in a way, try and give you an illustration of why this emphasis of Bhante's teaching is so important to me. Later on, I studied physics. Vajrashura and I both studied physics, so there you go, 2 physicists this weekend. And I studied it because I wanted to understand the nature of reality, and I felt that there was something. I, by then, had lost faith in religion, actually, no, that's not true. I thought of myself as a Buddhist quite early on in my teens. I'd lost faith in Hinduism. And but I was interested in science, and I thought that physics would give me some answers as to what's going on. And of course it doesn't, but what it did do for me was deepen the mystery. And I'm so glad. In some ways it let me down. I felt disappointed because in the end I was bored, and none of my tutors were really I felt very interested in the questions that I was trying to explore. So in some ways I was disappointed, in other ways it deepened the mystery. And what it did for me was make me convinced that common sense reality is not how it is. Common sense tells us nothing of the truth. Einstein said something very similar. It tells us nothing of the truth. We've evolved with these senses and our reason in order to survive, I think, not to, these senses and our reason don't necessarily reveal the truth. Well, they don't, but they do enable us to navigate this material realm. And so I've never been prey, I think, to scientific materialism as a view. And I find myself sometimes, when I'm teaching in London, saying to people, look, if you're going to be a scientific materialist, at least understand quantum physics and general relativity. Take the trouble to, you don't have to learn them, but take the trouble to know what science has to say, and has been saying for the last 120 years, about the nature of reality, because it's not what we think it is. It's weirder than... Who was it that said it's not only weirder than we think, but weirder than we can think? I think that's right. When I did become a Buddhist in Sri Ratna, I can remember going on a 5 Buddha mandala retreat. And it was at Vajraloka, and it was one of my first retreats. I think you were there. Were you there? Yes. And it had a huge impact on me, Now here I was given forms and mantras, and there was colour and qualities that I could aspire to. But more than that, this mandala felt alive to me. It felt alive. The childhood kind of, childhood attempts at finding meaning in a world beyond form, here I was being presented with that. And each of the Buddhas, as we went round them, Tejananda and others sort of explained the symbolism of the 5 Buddha mandala beautifully. And each of them seemed to me, all I can say is completely right. And I would each day go and try and find offerings of the right colour and da-da-da-da. And at the end of that retreat, I came across Vasantra's book, Meeting the Buddhas, and I was sort of flicking through it, looking just in a way, I don't know, anyway, it fell open at Vajrasattva, and it was just at the end of this retreat, and I had been thinking or intuiting that this 5 Buddha mandala was an exquisitely wonderful depiction of the way things are, but there needed to be another synthesis. There needed to be why wasn't there a coming together? And of course Vajrasattva, as Vasantra describes in the book, is the 6th Buddha, the Buddha that embodies, in a sense, all 5. And I had this sense that I'd found the goal of my life. And of course when I was ordained, I took up the Vajrasattva sadhana. So that was a little arc, a sort of potted arc of lots of other things happened in my life. But there was a trace of looking for meaning in through magic, I think, through magic, for want of a better word. And I think Bhante's so careful with his words, and when I read him, sometimes he's so not given to flights of fancy, at least in his prose writing. It's so careful, deliberate and thought through that it can feel, and also it's very clear, isn't it? It can feel like it's all laid out for you. But actually, my my senses, my experiences, that underneath Bhante's teaching and underneath the persona of the man, there's somebody wild and something extraordinarily untrammeled and pristine. And sadhana, his introductions, his giving us sadhana, his introducing sadhana into our system, gives us a doorway into this magic. Sadhana, of course, potentially it invites us to give all of ourselves, head, heart, body, life, to this practice, to an ideal. It becomes the whole of our lives. It can do, at least. And I think that distinguishes it, for me anyway, from other Vipassana practices. I think I want a myth in my life. I want a sense of why am I here? And sadhana keeps unfolding that myth for me. Sadhana also, I guess, more than perhaps other practices, seems to explicitly link us to our teachers. I mean, it explicitly evokes a sense of lineage. It's given to us in a ritual context, and Bhante says in his word on the Mantrayana that mantras need a ritual context to be given. They're not. He says that you don't come across a mantra by chance. It needs a ritual context. A mantra does not come to one by accident. It comes to one from a qualified guru who has received it from their own teacher, and so on, back along a line that may begin with an archetypal Buddha or Bodhisattva. The transmission of the mantra from guru to disciple generally takes place within a ritual context and creates between them a samaya, or bond, which binds the disciple to the guru for life and even beyond. This is 2 weeks before he died. Surely Bhante is talking about himself. He can't explicitly say, it wouldn't be right for him to say, I'm talking about myself. I am, a guru in this sense. If you look at the Vajrayana literally, then he probably isn't qualified in that sense. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't, I don't know. But what I do know is the transmission was real. And I think if we're receptive to it, we can be the recipients of that, even now that Bhante is no longer here physically. He has recently, I guess before he died, in the last few years, he's requested that when we ordain new people, that they are given sadhana practices that he had practiced. And again, this is a very obvious, I was going to say hint, but it's more than a hint, to say, look, we're building a lineage. There is a lineage, and can we honour this lineage? That feels to me very important. And I think there's something more going on. I think sadhana done properly, Satyaraja made this point recently, sadhana as it should be, is inseparable from the teacher, from the guru. And I don't think this is the case for all practices. So sadhana is inseparable from the guru. Maybe we don't always experience it like that. Maybe we're not always aware of the lineage. I know I'm not always aware of the lineage, although these days I think I am more and more aware when I do my sadhana. Bhante is present for me. But I think there's something about the nature of the practice itself that is about reverence, it's about devotion, and it doesn't make sense without revering your teacher. Does that make sense? I'm not very articulate here, but I want to turn to another piece of writing, Bhante on the Gaurava Sutta. And so again, very recently written. And this is Bhante just talking about his teachers. Nearer home, I looked up to and still look up to my personal teachers, honouring and respecting them as best I can in my own life and teaching. I look up to Jagdish Kashyap, who taught me Pali and Abhidharma. I look up to Chatral Sangye Dorje, who gave me the Green Tara initiation. I look up to Kachu Rinpoche, who gave me the Padmasambhava Sadhna. I look up to Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche, who initiated me into the sadhanas of Manjidosha, Avalokiteshvara, Vajrapani and Green Tara. I look up to Dudjom Rinpoche, who initiated me into the Vajrasattva sadhana. I look up to Dada Rinpoche, who initiated me into the White Tara sadhana and gave me the Bodhisattva precepts. I look up to Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, who introduced me to the Yellow Jambala, to White Tara and to Kurukula. To Yogi Chen too I look up, who shared with me the treasures of Vajrayana and Chan. I look up to all these compassionate teachers whose influence has entered into my life and has through me entered into the life of the Triratna Buddhist order. To them do I look up with devotion and endless gratitude. I mean, isn't that fantastic? Isn't that just fantastic? And I think when I read it, when I first read it, I didn't read the import of what was being said. But he names each of his teachers, and he names the practices that they initiated him into. Or in the case of Jagdish Kashyap, what Jagdish Kashyap taught him, Pali and Abhidharma. And it's inseparable in this little paragraph. It's inseparable. The teachers and the teaching are inseparable. And their influence, I look up to these compassionate teachers whose influence has entered into my life and has through me entered into the life of the Triratna Buddhist order. So there's an explicit declaration of lineage. Whether it fits in with the traditional understanding of how lineage works in the Vajrayana or not, here's Bhante saying, we're in a lineage. Yeah, we're in a lineage. Although what he's saying is whose influence has entered into the life of the Triratna Buddhist order. It's a beautiful way of putting it, I think, because an influence we have to choose to be open to or not. We don't have to be open to that influence, but it's there if we want it. The blessings, the adhisthana, keep flowing if we are receptive. So for me, that is an essential part of why I belong as part of this order. I can remember when I first started coming to the LBC, I can remember thinking, I don't know if these people, I like them. I meant order members, I like them. I think they've got something. In fact, I was in awe of them. So much so I couldn't even say hello. I was too shy, in awe. And at the same time, I had this doubt in my mind as to whether they were really Buddhists, because they didn't look like I imagined Buddhists to look. And I can remember one time Maitreyi gave a talk at our Sangha night, and she talked about Bhante's 8 main teachers. And my heart opened at hearing this. These names, these people who, of course, I would never meet. And I knew that there was a lineage. This was the real thing. And that Bhante was the real thing. He was a real Dharma teacher. Yes, so sadhana in lineage, sadhana in imagination, sadhana in lineage. Also, sadhana embodies in a mythic way the mystery of form and emptiness, the mystery that led me to spend 3 years trying to study physics and sort of fail, really. That I felt I couldn't have articulated what that mystery was, but sadhana embodies that mystery of what is this phenomenal world, what's going on, of appearance and emptiness. There's something fantastic, magical. It's a magic show, isn't it? Or Subhuti's been calling it the Maya way. Subhuti's wonderful talks on the Manjudosha Stuti Sadhana, given a few years ago. I really recommend them if you've not heard them. And then we had Prakasha's talks recently as sadhana on the convention. Both Prakasha and Vasanta have done so much to communicate how we practice sadhana. And Padmavajra with Guru Yoga and Padmasambhava. I feel very blessed to have teachers in our order. I could probably go on, but well, you're here and that you come to mind. Anyway, sadhana embodies in that mythic form the essential mystery. So I, after doing the Vajrasattva sadhana for about 6 years, took up the Manjudosha Stuti sadhana. And, as it's a cliche, but it's said that the Yidam chooses you. And in this case, that's how it did feel. I had no interest in Manjudosha consciously. He started appearing in the Vajrasattva sadhana. Vajrasattva would sometimes hold a sword, and sometimes underneath the Vajrasattva mantra, I could hear the Manjudosha mantra. And then one convention, I think it was, Kamala Shila gave a talk. He'd just come back from was it a year-long solitary that Kamala Shila did? He gave this incredible talk. He was so inspired. He gave this wonderful talk on the 5 Buddha mandala. And I can remember him saying, I can't remember anything very much about the talk, I'm afraid. I can remember feeling very uplifted. He said that the 5 Buddha mandala, the 5 jhanas exist. They exist. He'd obviously experienced something very profound in that solitary, and it was coming through him. That night, I had a dream. I don't have big dreams very often. I have a few in my life. I've had a few. I had a big dream of me in the blue sky, surrounded by a sphere of Manjudoshas, blazing orange, red, amber, yellow Manjudoshas in a sphere, lots of them. And then outside of that, there was a sphere of Vajrasattvas. So I was within this double sphere of... I told Subhuti about this, and thinking that he'd say to me, take up the Manjudosha practice. And he didn't. He just said, oh, we'll see what happens. He didn't seem very impressed by my archetypal dream. And then some time later, so I carried on doing the Vajrasattva practice, which I was very happy with, and it was beautiful, isn't it? It's beautiful practice. In a sense, it's all I needed. But I had another dream sometime later, and in this dream, I received a carrier bag of gifts from Subhuti, all individually wrapped, together with a letter. So I opened the letter first. I wish I'd opened the gifts, actually, but it's always the way, because I woke up before I could open the gifts. So. Anyway, I opened the letter, and the letter said, Dear Manjunatha. And, of course, we had a Manjunatha in the order, and I in the dream, I can remember thinking, he's got the wrong order member, and I've opened somebody else's letter. And but I read on, as you do, as I do anyway, I read on. It was a dream. I read on regardless. And somewhere in the letter, he then said, and I'm giving you another name, and it's Manjunatha, and I want you to take up the Manjudosha Stuti Sadhana. So it couldn't be more explicit. Like if it's like somebody saying, you didn't get me first time round with all those beautiful images. And so I did. Subhuti agreed. He relented, and I took it up. And Paramabandhu took me through that sadhana, which is the sadhana that I still do today. And the reason I say this partly is in the Manjughosha Stuti sadhana, it's very explicit that we see Manjughosha in the Maya way. The Maya way being where we see appearances arise and know that they're empty. There's emptiness, and yet there's appearances, empty appearances, magically arising. Maya being illusion. So this world is a magical illusion. And something about form and emptiness is it's what I keep sort of coming back to, partly because the sadhana points me back to that. But the sadhana, the Manjughosha Stuti sadhana, ends with another. What it says is, it says that when you're no longer meditating, that the practitioner should enter into the ways of day-to-day activity, and in the intervals when not meditating too, he should make all the ways of activity purposeful, through being inseparable from the embryo of voidness and compassion. Shunyata karanagarbha. Shunyata karanagarbha. And what Subhuti points out in his talks is that it's this coming together that is the ideal. A response to form and emptiness. Shunyata, but also this world of appearances that calls for a response of compassion, karana. Shunyata and karana, form and appearances, need to come together. In the Manjughosha practice, what Subhuti points out is that the blue sky, where we experience shunyata, we should ideally, in the sadhana, be experiencing letting go into shunyata. That's just the beginning of the practice. That's just the beginning of the practice. Then the form arises, and then there's the drama of the sadhana. And at the end, the form dissolves again, and we're left with this mystery of form and emptiness. Shunyata karana garbha is the ideal that we're aspiring to. And I say this because, of course, there's been so much recent discussion about insight, and I think it's been, some of it's been valuable. Some of it, I think, has been shockingly unhelpful, but some of it's been valuable. And I just want to put it in the bigger context. I mean, insight, how could we not be striving for insight, all of us? But I want to put it in the bigger mythic context of Shunyata Karanagarbha, of the mystery of form and emptiness, and therefore, what are we doing here as embodied beings? What is our purpose here as embodied beings in this world of form? So yes, sadhana. I've just talked about sadhana in as giving that mythic perspective. Sadhana is involving the whole of us in imagination. Sadhana in terms of lineage. And I want to now, in a way, come back to Bhante, and I guess what I want to, I guess it's obvious really to probably all of us, or most of us, that Bhante was deeply in touch with that mystery. I think he inhabited that mystery more deeply than anybody that I've ever met. I haven't met other tantric, I haven't met other Buddhist teachers actually, so but in my case, more than I've ever met, he embodied and inhabited this mystery. He was in touch, I believe, as at home even, I believe, with a reality beyond form, beyond time and space, beyond concepts, including concepts of existence and reality and emptiness and all of those words. He was in touch with that, and I don't kind of just believe that because I would like to believe that. I know that because I've had enough encounters with him to experience something of it. You know, a flake of light or whatever has entered into me, and I know it as true. And I know that it's come through him, from him to us. He's passed it on. He's communicated it. And he carried on communicating it right to his dying breath, I'm sure. But in this last piece of writing, that's the last communication, public communication. He's still communicating it. He's been able to communicate that in an incredibly clear way using concepts. I mean, he's explicated the Buddhist teachings in a way that I can't imagine being clearer, and so clear that I think myself and when I'm teaching back home, mitras that I'm teaching or whatever, I think that we don't realise, and I include myself in this, what a gift his clarity is, because it's only sometimes when I've encountered other Buddhist teachers that I can compare it, and then I think, oh, Bhante is phenomenally clear, deep, concise. He's communicated it through symbolism and imagery and encouraging our imagination, his poetry. I was rereading his poems, his collected poems, together with his memoirs, trying to read the poems. You can do this for the poems in India particularly. When he came back to Britain, he stopped writing so many. But anyway, you can do this. You can follow the memoirs and the poems together, and it's wonderful to do. And he's communicating through poetry as well. But also, I guess what I want to finish with is that he communicated that in ways that are not comprehensible, not conceptually graspable. He communicated it through his being. He communicated it through his blessings, through us, in a way. I think something, well, as he said, something founded the order through Bhante. Something came through, a transcendent reality came through Bhante. It sort of, he served it, didn't he? He offered up his life to this transcendent reality at a cost that I can only begin to imagine what that does to the human bit of a human being, to sacrifice, as it were, to let go of much of your personal, I don't know, consciousness to something higher. Anyway, he did that to an extraordinary degree, not perfectly, not fully. There was still the human being with his foils and fallibilities that we're left with. But goodness, they pale into insignificance for me anyway. When I touch in my imagination the enormity of what came through Bhante, and because it came through Bhante, and because he's passed it on to us through the ritual of ordination, and through us, to the wider Sangha, because he's done that, it's alive in us. It's alive in our Sangha. It's alive still. It's sort of a gift that won't die with Bhante. I guess it won't die if we keep it alive and we pass it on. We have to keep it alive and we have to pass it on. And that's up to us now, of course it is. However, in a way, I still believe that Bhante is still teaching somewhere. When the Buddha entered into parinirvana, his disciples must have felt that he was still around and communicating and teaching. And in my imagination, Bhante is still doing that. Sometimes in my dreams, every time I give a talk, and I've been giving quite a lot of talks, I pray. I pray to Manjughosha and I pray to Bhante. And last night I was praying slightly desperately because I didn't really know what I wanted to talk about and what I had to say. And it came to me in dreams, I guess. It was a semi-waking, semi-sleep kind of state where what I needed to say, what I wanted to say, was here. And I'm not making claims for that. I'm just saying that in my imagination, in my experience, Bhante is still teaching. Or he's still channeling something. Maybe, I don't know what it is. For me, the myth is real. I'll leave it there. Thank you.